Good evening, everyone. So first we're going to look at an announcement that Mr. Scheer is making. This is a policy plank for a safer Canada. So this is a 3-plank policy, and this one is all about gangs. So first we're going to hear about what the Liberals are doing, and then we're going to look closer at what the Liberals are doing. But first we're going to hear what Mr. Scheer has to say about it. So take it away, Mr. Scheer.
He is softening Canada's approach to dealing with gang violence. Bill C-75, which is actually before the House of Commons today, is the Liberals' most recent crime bill. And it reduces the penalty for gang crime to as little as an administrative fine. This failure has real consequences. It puts Canadians at risk by letting violent gang members remain at large on our streets, treating gang activity on the same level as speeding. It also breaks the trust Canadians should have in their government to look out for their safety and security. I want to restore that trust. That's why Conservatives will take action to make it easier for police to target gang members and put them behind bars where they belong. We're going to put an end to the revolving door prison system and take these violent thugs off of the streets for good. We're going to start by ending automatic bail entitlement for repeat gang offenders. Right now, even the most notorious gang members are entitled to bail. That means dangerous criminals with prior convictions who are known to police can be released right back onto the street. We will end that automatic bail eligibility and put the onus on repeat and dangerous gang offenders to convince a judge why they should get bail. And we're going to go further and strike at the criminal gangs themselves. We will enshrine a list of criminal organizations in the criminal code. This is similar to the list of known terrorist entities. Everyone knows that the Hells Angels and MS-13 are dangerous, violent gangs. Yet prosecutors have to prove this in court each time they prosecute a gang offense. This makes absolutely no sense and only wastes valuable and limited police resources. Next, a Conservative government will bring in mandatory sentences for instructing someone to commit a crime on behalf of a criminal gang. We will attach a tough mandatory sentence to this offense so gang leaders end up behind bars. Next, we will create new offenses for ordering and committing a violent offense on behalf of a criminal gang. And we're going to back these offenses with serious mandatory sentences. Finally, we'll revoke parole for gang offenders who choose to associate with an organization on the gang list. Parole is a privilege, not a right. And anybody who repeatedly chooses to associate themselves with groups who commit violence will lose that privilege and find themselves back behind bars. In the coming weeks, I will be announcing more policies, 2 more policy pillars in my plan for a safer Canada. Together, they will form the basis of a new Conservative government in 2019 and how that government will put the safety and security of Canadians ahead of the interests and the comfort of violent criminals.
So, okay job by Mr. Scheer. I give it a 78 out of 100. Just, there wasn't a takeaway that I could say, yeah, see, Scheer's ready. Here it is. Here's the takeaway thing from that. They're targeting gangs. They're targeting gangs. But I don't know that this goes far enough. I don't know that this is going to, there wasn't a whole lot of detail, right? I mean, this is what we're going to do. We're going to end the bail eligibility. Okay, I like that. Keeping people who get arrested in prison, that's good. List of criminal organizations to be enshrined in the criminal code. Well, I mean, then you get people who were formerly Hells Angels into the Angels or the Hells Angels who definitely aren't the Hells Angels, right? Like you get into splintering, you get into maintaining a list, and all of a sudden we've got, I mean, the second it's published, it's outdated, right? Like the second it becomes known, the same problem is going to come up. The prosecutor is going to have to prove allegiance or membership of this gang in the same way they're going to have to prove that the gang is a criminal organization. If everybody knows this and everybody knows the standard is you have to prove this, then I'm not sure why adding a layer of a list that now needs maintenance. I mean, it sounds like a layer of bureaucracy to me. How many people are we going to hire to maintain this list? Who's going to agree who's on the list? You're going to put me on the list if I start calling you names, Mr. Scheer? And I understand no, but maybe, right? Like, who's to say? Who's to say at what point does somebody who's a journalist or somebody on the internet who's commenting about the job of what journalists put out, punditry, become an enemy of the people, right? Well, when the government says so, is what history tells me. So that's interesting. Here is Canadian Lawyer, and this is a good article. The link is in the description. It's good to read. I'm going to read a lot of it because it lays it out so well. And I mean, they're lawyers, right? So they know how to write a good paper. So quote, broken promises in Bill C-75. I added the bill part. Sorry, guys. A little bit of creative license. Okay. First, the Liberals said they were going to base their justice policy on facts, not make up facts to suit their preferred policy. It was a simple promise, but a breath of fresh air after a decade of ideologically driven justice policy from the Conservatives. Harper's tough-on-crime rhetoric left us with more mandatory minimum sentences, watered-down privacy rights, and colder penal policies. The Conservatives said that these measures would deter crime and make our community safer, even when the evidence suggested precisely the opposite. Second, the Liberals said they would strengthen parliamentary committees so that they could better scrutinize legislation. Better government, they said, starts with better ideas. Parliamentary committees should not exist to toe a party line, but to ensure that expert evidence is incorporated into legislation so new laws can achieve their objectives. And this is me here. If anybody's been watching my videos, have a watch of Bill Marno's inability to answer questions. And that is an example of a parliamentary committee. That's a standing committee on finance. And they meet every month, presumably, possibly twice a month, depending on what's working its way through budgetary bills or whatever. And that's an exercise in futility to get an answer out of Mr. Morneau. Like, it's incredible to watch the chair of the committee allow such blatant non-answering of questions when the questions are very simple. What date will construction start? How much more money will this project cost taxpayers? Oh, well, 20 minutes later and there's no... Okay, sorry, 6 minutes later, and there's no answer. And you're no closer to understanding if Mr. Morneau understood the question in the first place, or if he's just using words that he understands, listing words that he knows the meaning of. Okay, back to the article. Sorry, I got waylaid there. Actually achieved their objectives. So, right, sure. Third, the Liberals said they would overhaul the justice system to ensure it achieved fair and just results. It all sounded so good, but it has all gone so wrong. Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould unveiled her self-described bold criminal justice reforms. The legislation, Bill C-75, was advertised as a silver bullet to unclog our courts and bring about a cultural shift that would result in a fairer justice system. Bill C-75 promised to speed up court cases by eliminating preliminary hearings for all but the most serious matters. It promised to make jury trials fairer by limiting an accused's ability to select a jury of his peers. Also, quietly slipped into the bill was a provision that would allow Crown prosecutors to simply file written copies of police officers' evidence instead of actually calling them at trial to testify. That got stricken. Wilson-Raybould's bold legislation was met with an immediate, loud, and visceral condemnation by criminal defense lawyers who called the bill an, quote, utter complete betrayal, an erosion of procedural safeguards that, quote, gravely misses the mark, a regressive blindslide, and, quote, worse than anything Harper ever did. Last week, Bill C-75 passed through the Justice Committee with few changes and is now one step closer to becoming law. Over the last decade, I have appeared dozens of times, this is the author, not me, before various preliminary committees to testify on new legislation. Last month, the author appeared before the Justice Committee and offered expert evidence on Bill C-75. I've seen how the parliamentary committees operate under the control of both Harper Conservatives and Trudeau Liberals. Sadly, there's little difference. Under Harper, the committees ignored expert evidence and refused reasonable amendments that would improve the legislation and avoid laws of dubious constitutionality. The same is true under the Trudeau government. The only difference is that the Liberals promised to do better. Despite hearing from 95 expert witnesses, the committee studying Bill C-75 recommended few changes. Even when there was a concurrence of opinion from these witnesses on various parts of the bill, there still were no changes. The Liberals, you see, voted as a bloc to keep the legislation mostly as originally proposed. It is almost like they made up their minds before the whole process started. Okay, now this is me aside. They did because that was a whipped vote, right? So the whip tells them how they're going to vote, and they vote that way. So that's how this works. Back to the article. Sure, there were a few small changes to the bill. The universally criticized provision of the bill that would allow police officers to file written evidence and avoid cross-examination was removed, and the government bowed to conservative outrage over the hybridization of some offenses. But most amendments based on the evidence presented at committee were rejected by the Liberal bloc. Take Bill C-75's elimination of preliminary inquiries for all but the most serious offenses. The government said this would speed up trials, but the expert evidence from defense counsel, prosecutors, academics, and civil rights groups was unanimous that preliminary hearings actually save court time and are an important procedural safeguard to avoid wrongful convictions. There was no explanation for why proposed amendments to preserve preliminary inquiries in accordance with the expert evidence was rejected by every Liberal on the committee. And so, with Bill C-75, the Liberals have broken 3 promises. They ignored the facts, they turned their backs on a constructive and evidence-based committee process, and they have done little to make the justice system fairer. The last betrayal may come as a shock. The Liberals have not only done almost nothing to reverse the damage inflicted by the Harper government, but they seem strangely proud to advance legislation that erodes procedural protections designed to prevent wrongful convictions. So that's from the Canadian Lawyer, and link is in the description. Well written, Mr. Michael Spratt, and interesting. This is from Huffington Post, and it essentially says the same thing about Bill C-75, highlighting generally the same shortcomings and just a different take on it from a different writer, but still worthwhile. Link is in the description. We're not going to go through it right now. I wanted to show you that Andrew Scheer and Doug Ford are working together on climate change, and they're working. Basically, this is an advertisement saying we're working together, and if he's the next Prime Minister of Canada, then we're going to repeal the carbon tax. Yay! So that also, yeah. So here it is.
And indeed Canada. Justin Trudeau's carbon tax is making life more expensive for Canadians. It's going to be more costly to fill your tank as you drive your kids to school and drive yourself to work. It's going to make home heating more expensive when you're running your furnace in the winter. That's why Conservatives are going to fight this carbon tax every step of the way and repeal it once we form government.
The only way we can get rid of this terrible, terrible tax, this carbon tax, which does nothing for our environment, it's a job-hurting, family-hurting tax, is by electing my friend Andrew Scheer as the next Prime Minister of Canada in 2019.
So again, policy. He's vowing to scrap the Trudeau legislated carbon tax for Ontario. So there you go. That's a decision to make. Standing on policy. Thank you, Mr. Scheer. Here was an interesting little story that I didn't find any other links about from Canadian press or anything like that. I didn't look long enough. I wanted to tell you about it because this happened yesterday, and I think it's really interesting. So this is a blue check mark, Sasa Patrice, I think. Well, he's a CBC Beijing bureau chief. And he's tweeting, so like this is legitimate from a CBC bureau chief. I didn't find, like I said, I couldn't find the CBC article, but I didn't look for a long time. So here's the tweet anyway. Quote, Canadian business on China's terms. Canada-China Business Council bans media from Finance Minister Bill Morneau's Beijing speech because Chinese officials don't want journalists at events. CBC, hashtag CBC at Canada-China. So that's an interesting turn of events. Is our press free? If it's free, do we get to report on our finance minister doing a speech in China? Evidently not if you're doing business with the Canada-China Business Council. Interesting. Tom Quiggin is weighing in, so that's good to see. But man, interesting turn of events, right? And this was an absolute just jaw-dropping speech that was delivered today by Nigel Farage in the EU Parliament, it looks like. And this is him tweeting it out. And I'm going to play the whole speech for you because it's just worth the watch. If you don't want to watch it, that's fine. But wow, I know this is international news, but this is really interesting. So here it is.
Per il gruppo Europa della Libertà e della Democrazia Diretta, la parola all'onorevole Farage.
Well, Mrs. Merkel, many of my Eurosceptic colleagues have been booing you this morning, but they shouldn't be in a way, because the British should be cheering you. Without you, we'd never have made it over the line with Brexit, and I want to thank you very much for that. And of course, many of these Eurosceptic groups on the right, the centre and the left will come back here after the next European elections in huge numbers, directly as a result of your immigration and asylum policy. Your weak and cope led to a huge migrant tide, indeed a stampede, that came across the Mediterranean. Young men coming from very different cultures who were not going to integrate. Young men, none of whom would have qualified as being genuine refugees. And I think in many ways, we looked at it in the referendum and we said, we don't want to be part of an increasingly German-dominated European Union, and we certainly don't want to pay the price for Mrs. Merkel's errors. And I believe, having heard you today and listening to senior French politicians over the last couple of days, that for us, leaving the European Union is now indeed a liberation. It's a European Union that we're told is now to become an empire, a militarised European Union, an undemocratic European Union, a European Union that seeks to continually expand to the east, a European Union that has launched a new Cold War against the United States of America, a European Union that tries to rewrite history. And I think 100 years on from the armistice, we should be genuinely worried. The idea that this new militarised union is somehow a recipe for peace, I suggest you all sit back and think a little bit more carefully. Maybe you should all reread history. The European project was set up to stop German domination. What you've seen today is a naked takeover bid. So I think Brexit becomes a necessity after this. And for the rest of the countries, Mrs. Merkel, you've had a long, successful career. But your political decision to open up the doors unconditionally is the worst decision we've seen in post-war politics in Europe. Is it not time for you at last to admit that you were wrong? Is it not time for you to say to German communities and many others, I'm sorry for what I've done to you and the problems I've inflicted upon you for many decades to come?
Right? What a good speech. Wow. I mean, I want to high-five him. High-five, Mr. Farage. So that's it tonight. People are talking. I know Mr. Farage has been outspoken in the past. They've tried to paint him as a bad, a negative politician and a joke, et cetera, et cetera. But he's a representative. He's an elected representative, and he is calling it as he sees it, and that's how he sees it. So these things are being seen by the people in charge. The conversations are happening. Interesting. Thanks for watching, everybody.